Hello, and welcome to the History of Biology podcast. Episode 1: Aristotle on the Shore. What is life? What is death? And what is in between? These are the questions that have kept many people up at night, even in ancient times. What does it mean to be alive? What distinguishes something that is alive from something that is not alive? Is there a specific set of characteristics that applies to every living thing? And if so, why are there so many forms of living things that are vastly different from each other? And what about us, people, humans? Are we special? And if so, why and how? Could it be that the very fact that we can ask these questions and reflect on them is what makes us special? What exactly makes us capable of asking these questions? For anything to be called into question, both it and its opposite must be experienced. Question the existence and nature of life, one must also question the existence and nature of unlife, commonly known as death. There is a cycle in nature that is instinctually known to every living thing. For example, the grass grows, the antelope eats the grass, the lion eats the antelope, the lion dies, and where its bones lay, the grass grows taller. This is the circle of life. All of the participants are aware of it, and although they struggle to survive while they are full of energy, they accept their role and perish when their energy wanes. Some living things even exhibit specific behaviors when they are dying that were not present before. For example, the grass turns dry and can be a good fuel if the fire starts near it, clearing the soil and enriching it with ash. Sick antelopes may leave the flock and follow it at a distance, exposing themselves to predators and thus saving the lives of the healthy ones. When a young lion dominates the old, withered leader, he leaves the pride to hunt on his own, just as he made countless others live when he was stronger. Being at the top of the food chain, he will continue to hunt until he is killed or too injured to hunt and then starves. Death comes for the older to make room for the younger. However, humans can sometimes deviate from this script. Some of us care for our elderly very much, and some of them do not accept that the time is coming. So, the young may be willing to take care of the old indefinitely, and the old may be willing to live forever, and yet they still die. Then they come to the young in their dreams, communicating with them, either blaming them for their demise or continuing to guide them with the wisdom they acquired during their lives, or even with something that they saw only after they died. Often, they ask for something to be done with their remains, so they can be at peace. Or sometimes they don't ask for anything, and just hold the living, ruining their lives until they are neutralized. Either way, funeral rites begin to occur and then become institutionalized. People study things to determine whether a person is alive or dead, so they can begin the rites. No doubt, this started after some false alarms that must have been uncomfortable for everyone involved. Heartbeat and breath are two obvious indicators of life. Something also seems to leave the body when a person exhales for the last time. The heart might still beat for a while after that, but then it stops too. So, evidently, the heart is the organ of life, where something that makes us who we are resides and operates, generating a heartbeat. Something is called a spirit or psyche due to its connection to the act of breathing. However, the presence of a spirit is not limited to just the heart. There is also a dream realm where the spirits escape and sometimes communicate with the living. Some spirits are more powerful than others and can interact with each other. For example, the spirit of cunning and the spirit of luck manifest themselves through foxes hunting rabbits. Through our interactions with the living things and their symbolic representations, we can harness the power of these spirits, like through a father's fox through a mantle or a lucky rabbit's paw. Despite this, these beliefs rely heavily on circumstantial evidence, and the spirits are fickle and not reliable. It seems someone has to actually sit down and investigate to find some hard evidence if he wants to find out the truth. Let's start with the basics. What is it that makes humans special? It seems that the living body is composed of parts that have specific functions, and there must be a specific part that makes the distinction between humans and other living things possible. But when discussing this with experts such as butchers or physicians, it becomes evident that there isn't any one material thing that makes this distinction. Living things such as fish, insects, plants, and even crystals share similarities with humans and possess some form of life force that cannot be seen or felt directly. This life force is distributed unevenly, creating a hierarchy of life, with the static plants at the bottom and the active animals in the middle. Humans, who possess everything any other animal does, but also something more that makes them special, have the most and/or purest form of this life force and sit at the top. Now, I am by far not the first person to come up with an idea like that, and so I would like to take us to that first person, at least as far as we know. His name is Aristotle. He probably formulated it standing on the shore of the Isle of Lesbos in the evening, after a walk through the lagoon that became his object of interest because it was and still is a remarkable example of the diversity of life. Aristotle was a philosopher and a scientist born in 384 BC. His father was a physician who taught him as much as he could, before both of his parents passed away when Aristotle was 13 years old. At 17, Aristotle moved to Athens to study and immerse himself in the city's culture. After 20 years, he left Athens to live with a friendly king, and later moved to Lesbos with his pupil after his friend died. He was raised in Macedonian royal court. He had slaves all his life who he believed were a natural and beneficial part of society. He had a strong hatred for Persian barbarians and democracy, and he did not keep it to himself. You might have noticed that so far, my account of him has been very negative, and I deliberately left out or obfuscated some crucial details and picked a moment of time before most of his famous deeds. I assure you that I harbor no ill will toward Aristotle, and that it was merely an intentional attempt to show ways in which he was a man of his times in order to somewhat contrast the many ways in which he was very much ahead of them. In his History of Biology, released in 1928 after Erik Nordenskjöld, described the dichotomy as such. Quote, often, when reading his writings, one can fancy that one hears an inquisitive pupil offering objections which the master takes up with undisturbed calm and answers with unnerving assurance, in accordance with the principles of his system, as, for instance, why men and not women become bald, why the sow produces many pigs while the cow bears only one calf, etc. The result is that, while the reader can sometimes trace in his writings the pen of a biologist with almost a modern view of life phenomena, on the next page he may receive the impression of a master of scholastic disputation from a medieval university. End quote. In many ways, especially in his work on natural sciences, he seems so much closer to our way of thinking that his contemporaries that this makes the errors in his epistemology seem that much more surprising and upsetting to a modern biologist. Just like in ecology, where the more similar the individual organism or populations are in the ecological niche, the more intensely they compete, Aristotle's views are so contentious because they are placed in almost the exact same niche that modern biology resides in. The same way the Romans had the basic ingredients for a steam engine and technically could have come to the first stages of early industrialization, Nordenskjöld argues that there was a sound theory of evolutionary biology that could have been derived out of Aristotle's systematics and evolutionary ideas, and Democritus's theory of the dominance of necessity in nature. Alas, just like with the steampunk Romans, the world of Darwinian ancient Greeks is relegated to alternate history because in real history the environment that could produce this outcome didn't last enough to do so. Still, if I were to allow myself to venture in the alternate history for just a moment, it seems to be within reason that the slave-owning Athenian society that called anyone not integrated into their culture barbarians and was constantly at odds with other Greeks' policies would probably turn to social Darwinism in record time. There was a wave of energy from discovery of evolutionary biology that invigorated all social and natural scientists in the 19th century and inspired a lot of significant figures of history. If the same could happen in time to allow Greece to develop the political institutions, agriculture, and industry, they would certainly attempt to develop a much more expansive Athenian empire. The state would compete with the successor states to the recently divided Alexandrian empire. The connection between Aristotle and Alexander would most likely be used by all parties as a claim to power, but that's just a fun scenario to think about. Aristotle was a pioneer in the development of biology, but he rejected some of the ideas, such as the importance of fossils, that turned out to be necessary for our understanding of reality. He was also very conservative, which didn't help with accepting new ideas. He was open to further evidence, but he was adamant about his fundamental system. It is speculated that most of the work attributed to him was done by his disciples at his instruction, and then by people that lived long after his time. He often cited his sources, but there is no way of knowing where he omitted the mention of inspiration from others, but it was probably without any malice. After all, the modern concept of authorship was not yet established. Consequently, Aristotle as a person is only the biggest part of a combination of ideas and deeds known as the Great Aristotle. To push back a little on my somewhat uncharitable introduction and set the ground for discussing his biological theories, I will quote a more traditional recounting of his life, again, from Nordenskjöld History of Biology. Quote, Aristotle was born in 384 BC at Stagira, a small Greek colony on the Macedonian coast. His father, Nicomachus, belonged to an old family of the Asclepiads and was, like several of his ancestors, a body physician to the Macedonian royal family. His predecessors among the Greek philosophers had lived among the mobile and restless communities of the city republics, while Aristotle spent his childhood at a royal court, and a semi-barbarous one at that. This fact undoubtedly put its stamp on his personality and way of thought. He became in every respect an upholder of authority and conservatism. At an early age he lost his father, and his mother Theseus retired to her native city and brought up her children there. Aristotle received his early education in accordance with the ancient Asclepiad tradition from his father's colleagues, who initiated him into the biological and medical learning of the profession. It was necessary, however, for a properly educated physician to receive also philosophical instruction, and for this purpose Aristotle was sent at the age of 18 to Plato's academy at Athens. There he remained for 20 years and was initiated into the teachings of his master, wrote his first treatise, and already at that period began to oppose his master's authority, which the latter is said to have observed with no little displeasure. After Plato's death he was passed over at the election of a successor as head of the academy, in spite of his already established reputation, and retired to Asia Minor, where he settled down at the court of the Persian vassal prince Hermias of Athanaeus, who gave him his niece in marriage. Some years later, however, Hermias was deposed under a revolution, and Aristotle had to flee to the country of his birth, Macedonia. There he was charged with the task of educating the heir to the throne, Alexander, the future conqueror of the world, and he held this post for 3 years. What influence the master exercised on the pupil is of course difficult to decide. The relations between them, however, were on a whole good, though Alexander's increasingly despotic character and barbaric outburst of passion must have offended the cultured, self-controlled Aristotle. His profession as teacher, at any rate, brought Aristotle illustrious honors and made him a wealthy man, able to choose his place of abode and his sphere of activity. He then moved back to Athens and lived there under the protection of Alexander, highly esteemed by a constantly increasing throng of pupils for the space of 12 years. He displayed indefatigable activity. He was granted the right to use for educational purposes a temple dedicated to Apollo Lyceus, after whom the place was called the Lyceum, the archetype of learned education institutions throughout the world. Here every morning Aristotle gave scientific lectures to his chosen pupils, often old and highly reputed men of science who collaborated with him, and, further, every evening he has more popular courses for younger collegiates. Moreover, he found time to write an incredible amount on very different subjects: logic, metaphysics, art, politics, psychology, and biology. This extraordinary activity testifies to his inexhaustible energy and splendid powers of organization. It is obvious that his disciples had to carry out the rough work. Aristotle kept aloof from public life. Indeed, he was a foreigner in Athens. He was a conservative and a monarchist, however, and when after Alexander's death Athens rebelled against the Macedonian supremacy, his position became dangerous. For the lack of other means of calumniating him, he was accused, like Socrates, of godlessness. In order, as he himself said, to save the Athenians from committing a fresh crime against philosophy, he fled to the island of Euboea. There he died shortly afterwards, in the year 322. In external appearance he is said to have been of small stature and corpulent. His carriage was proud, his manner arrogant and sarcastic, his dress and way of living courtly, refined, and elegant. These latter characteristics brought him personal enemies, who sought to blacken his character. It is not possible, however, to bring any serious accusations against him as a private person. It is true he appropriated with considerable lack of bias the results of the work of earlier philosophers, but the ideas of literary copyright were not so strict as they are now. On the other hand, he treated different thinkers with true humanity. His polemics, when he went in for them, were always courteous, and his arguments founded on facts. Towards his family, his friends and pupils, and even his slaves, he was affectionate and considerate." End quote. To give a little context, I will add some historic details. Around 347 he married Pythias, the niece and adopted daughter of King Hermias, and they had a daughter also named Pythias. His father, Nicomachus, was a personal physician to specifically King Amysias of Macedon. He probably visited the court with him, as it is said that he later was on friendly terms with Amyntas' son, the future King Philip II, and they probably met there as they were of similar age. These ties could have been the real reason why he left Athens the first time just as the second, as the tensions between Athenians and Macedonians were at an all-time high during both of these incidents. In that context, some historians argue that his tutoring of Philip's son, the future King Alexander the Great, was a later invented myth, and that he was recalled to the royal court because his aspirations to lead the academy could have been viewed as useful for spreading the Macedonian influence, because the leader of the academy at that time, Speusippus, was staunchly anti-Macedonian. When Speusippus died during the preparations for war in 340 BC, the positions went to Xenocrates, and King Philip lost his interest in Aristotle. And so, he went to his hometown, Tigeri, with his circle of followers. He also lost his wife and found a mistress from his hometown, named Phyllis, and had a son named Nicomachus, after his father. Aristotle remained in relative obscurity until Philip's son Alexander, whom he always supported, assumed the throne in 336 BC, and sent him to Athens to found the rival organization to the academy, whilst he simultaneously publicly supported its activity. It must be said that this notion of Aristotle as cultural infiltrator is highly contested. Nevertheless, Aristotle reached Athens and established the Lyceum in 335 BC. During the 12 years of his activity there, he would compose most of his work. Going back to the more accepted version of his relationship with Alexander, during the 3 years that he was his tutor, the classes were not always one-to-one, and he also tutored 2 of his future generals, and, after Alexander's death, kings of Egypt and Macedonia, Ptolemy and Cassander respectively. There is no reasonable evidence that would support the theory that Aristotle prepared the poison that led to the death of Alexander in 323 BC, after which anti-Macedonian feelings in Athens made Aristotle retire to Chalcis, where he lived in the house which had once belonged to his mother and was still retained by the family. He died the following year from a stomach complaint at the age of 62. To quickly summarize, he was born in 384 BC in Stagiri, lost both of his parents when he was about 13, at 17 he left to study in Athens, at about 37 he went to Assos and sometime after left for the neighboring isle of Lesbos, and at about 40 he married. At about 42 he went to tutor Alexander, at 45 he returned to Stagiri, and at 49 he established the Lyceum. After fleeing Athens at 61 and staying in Chalcis in his mother's house with his relatives, he died from a stomach complaint at the age of 62 in 322 BC. Considering the impact that he left on humanity, the fact that he accomplished so much in such a short amount of time is truly remarkable. When it comes to this retelling of his life focused on biology, it all really started to pick up steam on Lesbos, when he was in his prime by his own account and mostly focused on natural sciences, which is why we will start here. Aristotle was a master of observation and classification, which he applied to the natural world. On Lesbos, he recorded his observations on the flora and fauna and classified them according to common characteristics. He also spoke with hunters and fishers and learned a lot from them. He grouped animals based on their physical attributes such as their habitat, diet and body structure. This laid the foundation for his belief that all living things could be organized into a hierarchical system. He believes that all living things had a specific place in the natural world and that everything was connected in a chain of being, or scala natura, with the most perfect and highest form of life being the man. Aristotle's philosophical and scientific work was extensive, and he made significant contributions to the fields of metaphysics, ethics, politics and biology. He believed in the idea of a prime mover or an unmoved mover, which was a fundamental principle responsible for the existence of all things in the world. In his view, the prime mover was a godlike figure who was responsible for the organization and movement of the universe. He also had a particular interest in animal behavior and their lifestyles, and often made comparisons between human and animal behavior in his writing. In terms of Aristotle's contribution to the study of plants, it's important to note that his own work on the subject has not survived. However, his apprentice and later successor as the head of the Lyceum, Theophrastus, was much more prolific in that field. We will return to him in the next episode. Regarding cosmology, Aristotle was fundamentally a follower of his teacher Plato, whose cosmology can be found in his book Timaeus. Plato's musings in Timaeus are a contemplation on the nature of life, associated with the existence of multiple souls and viewing illness as a manifestation of imbalances. He saw the universe itself as a living entity, an idea that reflects in his contemplative approach to the world. Aristotle wasn't particularly groundbreaking in the idea of elements. He believed there were 4 elements of fire, air, water and earth, but he did not believe there were atoms. However, his distinction between matter and form proved to be a seminal contribution to biology. Although historically it was believed his natural history work was secondary to his philosophy and physics, it appears that many of his conclusions on the latter two are best understood through analogies provided by his work on living things. Thus, natural history was not a side activity for him, but a basis upon which he based most of his other work. In his philosophy, Aristotle saw disease and death as rooted in matter, while the essence and species identity were derived from form. He believes that reproduction was the result of union between the matter from the female seed and the form from the male seed, which he used to explain the initiation of embryonic development. These ideas continue to be studied and discussed by contemporary biologists and philosophers. Aristotle's studies in the natural world also led him to propose his own theory of motion. He believed that everything in the natural world was in a state of motion and that this motion was caused by an inner principle or cause, which he referred to as actuality. This theory of motion was later incorporated into his broader philosophy, which saw the world as being made up of series of causes and effects. Aristotle distinguished between the 4 causes: material cause, efficient cause, formal cause, and a final cause. He uses examples for human activities such as the creation of a statue to illustrate the different roles of these causes. The stone would be is the material cause, the chisel is the efficient cause, the image that the sculptor wants to represent is the formal cause, and the final cause is the project of the statue, which wants to become a statue from the very beginning. In modern times, only the efficient cause is still considered a cause, while the material, formal, and final causes are no longer considered valid. In his anatomical work, he was very thorough and systematic. Aristotle recognized the importance of the so-called fermentation, which was a grab-bag term that attempted to describe any unexplainable biological phenomena like the digestion by comparing it to cooking the food and fermenting the wine. He was also aware of the importance of mechanical movement in living things, as demonstrated by his explanation of the role of tendons in limb movement. These two explanations of biological phenomena, fermentation and mechanical movement, would be very influential in the coming millennia. In contrast to his anatomy, Aristotle's physiology was heavily influenced by his philosophical worldview, and he gave great importance to heat. For example, he believes that the heart, which heated the whole organism, was the home of the soul and the first organ to be formed. A lot of his belief in things like the importance of fermentation, four causalities, and the central role of the heat that was generated by the heart were based on his embryological work, namely on his study of the development of chicks in the eggs. We will discuss it in detail in the next episode. However, despite his embryological observations, Aristotle believed in spontaneous generation, the idea that life could arise from non-living matter if it contained vital heat or pneuma. He believed that this would occur in certain species of fish, specifically in eels, because he couldn't find their sex organ during dissections. Aristotle, as was previously mentioned, also differentiated between three types of the soul in living things: the vegetative soul, which is common to all, the sensitive soul, which is found only in animals, and the rational soul, which is specific to human beings. It is very similar in many regards to Plato's conception of golden, silver, and bronze part of the soul that divided the classes in a fictional utopian city from his book The Republic. However, it is important to mention that Aristotle believed that the soul, including the rational soul, could not be separated from the body, in contrast to Plato's views. In this way, a soul can be viewed not as an entity, but as an emergent phenomena, resulting from the life that is itself emerged from matter and strives for the perfect form, in particular to be like one of the celestial bodies, which are the embodiment of the perfect form, as they are immortal and beyond mortal concerns. From this drive to the perfect form, we get his concept of a chain of being, or scala natura, where we observe a ladder of living creatures with humans at the top. This was the basis of the hierarchical structure of taxonomy, as anthropocentric as it was, and in some way still is. This cosmological baggage, along with other traditions that formed the environment in which Aristotle lived, can be named as the main reason for the abundance of errors in his findings. Specifically, the reason was in fact his reliance on pure reason instead of rigorous experimentation, or, in other words, on thought experiments instead of actual experiments. Despite him often being portrayed as a grounded thinker in opposition to the idealistic Plato, he was in fact far more idealistic than, say, contemporary atomists with whom he disagreed in many ways. Due to the disproportionate influence of both Plato and Aristotle in later history, the discourse in many fields, including biology, was distorted from a natural vast spectrum into a dichotomy where both sides agreed on a lot of things. This arrangement turned out to be very long-lasting, and we will discuss it again and again in the future episodes. Now, let's linger for some time on the relationship between individuals and institutions, specifically on the way it affects philosophical and academic writing, because this relationship, in my opinion, plays a key part in the development of biology. Despite my attempts to be grounded, you can expect much more of "I feel" and "I will" from here on. With that out of the way, how much of the great Aristotle's collection of works was written by Aristotle himself? Due to the habit to mark everything with Aristotle's name that his disciples practiced and later scholars seem to have inherited from them and added it to even more writings, we can't say for sure. Was it because of something else, something more deliberate? Was it voluntary or imposed? And if it is the latter, to what extent and in which form? The modern way of crediting authors, co-authors, and institutions that provide you with the necessary funding and materials for this work to be made was not yet formed, and wouldn't be formed for some time until the printing press made publishing and distribution of books feasible. Books have changed dramatically from the ancient times, so it is also necessary to go over the way they were made and kept back then. Firstly, on which material and with what. Secondly, how was the text formatted. Lastly, how were they used, catalogued, and preserved. On the question of materials, the most uniform thing you will find about the subject is that nothing about it was uniform. Geography and culture played a key role in determining what you could work with, and the distribution was uneven. Ancient Greece drew a short straw and had to rely on skin as the writing material, which contributed, along with the necessity of travel to gather information and small percentage of the literate population, to making the use of writing for academic purposes available to a few. Fortunately, as with many cultures where a similar situation was present, the oratory method of preservation, such as consistent rhyming schemes that are still very helpful for mnemonic memorization and distribution of the whole text or parts of it among many people were highly developed and widespread to compensate. So, you only needed to get one person out of the few that can write to show enough interest in the text that might have been around evolving and not distorting for hundreds of years. They would capture it in that moment in time, and if the text can survive through copying and translating and deliberate or accidental stashes in places where it wouldn't degrade very fast until now, they are still available today. Socrates famously didn't write anything down, but his disciple Plato did, and although it made unclear what exactly came from which of them, it at least preserved some information. The Iliad and the Odyssey were written down hundreds of years after their conception, and yet were preserved with such accuracy that they combined with the directions from the local people proved invaluable to Heinrich Schliemann's quest to uncover the mythical city of Troy and take the world by storm, which in turn significantly advanced the field of archaeology and attracted people and funding. To digress, they were very needed as there weren't enough established procedures for archaeologists, often along with making inaccurate and often opinionated and prejudiced conclusions, damaged their findings in the process of acquiring them and made re-examinations much more difficult. Schliemann wasn't even an archaeologist himself, and so he proceeded to blow the most of the upper levels of the city up with the recently discovered dynamite to get to the parts he was looking for, and thus a lot of material was lost forever. Returning to the subject of ancient books, there are many ways in which you can write down the text. From hieroglyphics to binary, there have always existed predecessors, successors, and alternatives to the alphabetic model. Even if you stay within this model, there is a myriad of specific ways to organize it. For example, from where and to where do you write? All of these things were changing mostly very gradually and on a case-to-case basis. Because of that, going forward, I will make an overview and only mention things of that nature. Academic literature has a very specific history with the languages that it uses, and it is still present in the modern papers. Here is a very simplified picture of dominant languages in philosophy and, by extension, science, in the Mediterranean and then gradually the Western cultural sphere, constructed for the sake of convenience. Right during the time of Aristotle, Alexander the Great, for better or worse, Hellenized all of the territories within and adjacent to his short-lived empire, and the main language of philosophy began to be Greek. Even during the time of the Roman Empire, it remained that way, with Greek culture dominating the Latin one. Especially in the eastern part of the empire, which survived much longer and came to be known as Byzantium, and in a few centuries after the loss of the western part, almost completely abandoned the Latin language, save for the military commands during battle, and some other culturally significant terminology. In the western part, only after the so-called fall of the Roman Empire, which can be more accurately described especially considering the feelings of the inhabitants at the time, at the transition to a new, much more decentralized form of governance, the church, one of the few surviving institutions, took on itself many previously secular roles, including education, and established Latin as the main language of philosophy, as it was the language that they used for their operations. With the rise and something golden age of Islam, which ended with the Mongol invasions and the destruction of Baghdad, Arabic became a major language in philosophy. Many of the ancient texts from the West and East were preserved by being translated into Arabic and then were translated again, along with many original works by Muslim scholars introduced into Europe. Some of the ancient texts were preserved in Ireland and in other places by being translated into Latin, which remained as the prevailing language of philosophy for hundreds of years until the Reformation. Then German, French, and English began the fight for prominence, appearing as contenders in that order one after another. Right now, the most used and accepted system of writing in biology is a hybrid model, with English as lingua franca, Latin as the main language for nomenclature, and Greek for most of the medical terminology. For our mathematics, we use Arabic numbers that came from India, with the base 10 for almost everything except time, which uses base 60. That tradition comes from Babylon. Even if the article is written in Japanese, which is completely different in almost every way from any of the languages mentioned before, it usually includes an abstract in English with Latin and Greek words and using Arabic numbers and terminology in its main body. So, now that we know so much about materials and the language that were used for writing ancient books, how were they organized? Even though books were rare, both academic and personal libraries of prominent figures eventually grew to a size where they had to employ people to maintain them. Scribes wrote catalogs and made copies of books, wrote bibliographies which contained the list of all works attributed to one author, and also compilations of excerpts on a certain topic for the purpose of lending or gifting them to interested parties and just to preserve and organize the information. Thus, the beginning of the modern systems of data management were born, and their basic principles are still used today. Later on, especially after printing made possible the creation of big foliants, which contain the equivalent of several books in one, and thus finding the specific part you are looking for started to be problematic, this useful extra started to be included inside the book at the beginning and at the end, as indexes, references, annotations and glossaries, together with the information about the publishing house. So, what does all of this has to do with Aristotle? The main point I'm trying to make is that the greatest contribution Aristotle made to biology was not in his actual findings and theories, which definitely were much more in-depth than everything else that came before and survived till today, but also were correct about as often as they were wrong. The main point I'm trying to make is that the greatest contribution Aristotle made to biology was not in his actual findings and theories, which definitely were much more in-depth than everything else that came before and survived till today. His main contribution was in his approach to obtaining these findings and his position on correcting them if new information was obtained. First in developing this approach and using it personally, and then in making an institution that created an environment where many people could learn this approach and then participate in it as a collective based on methodology and not dogma. The scientific method is undeniably a successor to Aristotelian method of epistemology. Even in its incomplete state and practice for a short amount of time, it produced a wealth of knowledge that was, true or not, complete enough to serve as a foundation for a worldview for millions of people for hundreds of years. Still, another thing to consider is that even though he made a huge leap forward, he wasn't the first person to make a move in that direction. And I'm not even talking about the unknown amount of people who pondered the questions that we tried to tackle in the beginning of this podcast, and whose name history has already forgotten by the time Aristotle was born, even though they do deserve much more attention than we are giving them here. The Ionian philosophers who we mentioned before, and from which Aristotle undoubtedly borrowed many ideas, were the first on that path, particularly Anaximander. I feel it would be useful to compare Aristotle to a more modern history figure, Henry Ford. Henry Ford was an innovator in the field of automobile production and consequently a trendsetter in almost everything that is necessary to maintain this business, for better and for worse. From obtaining the raw materials up to the way you get consumers to have enough income to afford your product. But he didn't do it by himself in a vacuum. He didn't invent the automobile, nor did he personally oversee every aspect of his operations. He most likely participated in things like that, especially early on, but his most important contribution was in creating a comfortable environment for the specialists, hiring and managing them, and also branding. Because Henry Ford doesn't do anything anymore, for he is gone from this world, but Ford TM, the brand, and the company are still very much around. So, when Aristotle himself, coming from Plato's Academy TM, established his Lyceum TM with funding from Alexander the Great, it was akin to Henry Ford establishing his company. No matter what the person himself did after it became more or less self-sustaining, his brand would continue to grow and encompass much more than the one person can accomplish in a lifetime. Even when the physical complex came into disrepair and the scholars left, the brand endured and kept producing things and being co-opted to add legitimacy to the text for some time. It may even include in time things that they would prefer not to be associated with their name. I'm almost certain Aristotle would be quite upset to find out about scholastic methods in medieval Europe, that he praised on him while at the same time whitewashing his works and throwing out parts of them that they deemed unnecessary. For instance, all of his illustrations were thrown out. There are still references to them in the books which they copied. Luckily for us, they were recreated as much as possible in the Armand Marie Leroy's book The Lagoon, How Aristotle Invented Science. Nevertheless, his surviving biological work is probably mostly done by him, or he was a co-author, or he was standing near and nodded approvingly, or at least he was on the premises when it was done in his name. But we really can't know for certain. Aristotle himself would have most likely seen himself as a prolific, but only the most recent natural philosopher, whose methods and findings were not above criticism. But due to the sheer numbers of works bearing his name in a plethora of subjects that grew beyond his personal works, and a number of historical events that created an environment that significantly slowed down the rate at which the research had been done under his leadership. Environment that significantly slowed down the rate at which research has been done after he passed, his finding became influential. The so-called Corpus Aristotelicum, which is a collection of works that survived as opposed to those that were lost or intentionally destroyed, was compatible with monotheistic religions enough to reach a critical mass and become a part of the institutionalized traditions of those religions that were not to be questioned or expanded upon. This became the tradition, which is defined by Urban Dictionary as peer pressure from dead people. To question Aristotle was almost as blasphemous as to question the church itself. That is to say, it was still allowed, but only in very specific circumstances, with preconceived notions, and by the people that were very deeply involved in the institution, and only among themselves. Now that we took Aristotle and broke him down to just a prolific researcher that made contributions to an already existing tradition of natural philosophy and had a good connections in both academic and political spheres of influence, and used those connections to fund his own academic institution, connections and used those connections to found his own academic institution after losing a power struggle for a leading position at his alma mater and a fresh start at the Isle of Lesbos. We will conclude the podcast by building him back up. He is widely recognized as the father of biology. Many historic events in academia and other fields, be they good or bad, were inspired partly or fully by him. He was and still is many things to many people from all walks of life, and that alone deserves some recognition. No matter how you approach it, Aristotle is a titan on whose shoulders a wide variety of subjects, including modern biology, stands. And as people interested in biology, so do you and me. Doesn't matter whether you try to be respectful about it, or trample all over him and his work, or refuse to even look down and see him and others below and around him, like Hippocrates, of course, father of medicine, whom he called the Great Hippocrates, or Sushruta, father of surgery, who he didn't know due to geographical and temporal barriers, and many others whose names and deeds are lost to history. You simply cannot escape him, because if you could ask your teachers to ask their teachers and so on about who taught them what they knew about biology, you would have inevitably had stopped at a medieval scribe rewriting his surviving works without trying to question the contents or even replicate his methods, which would, ironically, probably annoy him more than it would anyone else if he was informed that a collection of lecture notes for hundreds of years would be the source of the first and the last word on an extremely wide range of subjects. Maybe not so much for subjects that can be really proven or disproven, but judging from the way he wrote about bees, he expected his successor to continue his work and correct it if new evidence demanded it. He would be even more aggravated if you then showed him some simple experiments like those of Francesco Redi in 1668 that proves that flies don't generate spontaneously, and explained even the most basic version of scientific theory, which is itself very much a successor to his own philosophy for two reasons. Firstly, he would be disappointed that he didn't think of that himself, and secondly, that it took us so long to get there. Luckily for us, the scholastic narrative that all work related to natural history is just unnecessary after his work did not form for hundreds of years after his passing and was not shared by everyone with access to his body of work. He had his followers at the Lyceum, and more than 2 centuries later, after Sulla uploaded his books into at the time new and actively forming high-speed network of road cities, later called the Roman Empire, while the lights of the flames of the burning city of Athens were still dancing on his reddish skin, accentuated the striking white patches on his face, they slowly but surely made their way into the first Mediterranean and then beyond it, particularly in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, with many other works from both west and east where they were translated along with the work of before mentioned Sushruta, allowing the scholars that came after to break the barrier that separated them, and place one leg on the shoulder of Aristotle and another on the shoulder of Sushruta and see even further than both of them could. That process started in the 8th century as a beginning of the golden age of Islam, which was then cut short in the middle of the 13th century by the Mongol siege and subsequent ruination of the city of Baghdad and their own network of irrigation canals which sustained the region. Despite the raging of the tides of war that impacted not only his life and work, but also the life of his work after his passing, there always were, and still are, those who read his enduring words in many languages. And even if his books on biology are rife with mistakes and are plagued by the lack of experimental evidence, statistical analysis, peer reviews, and later works make them obsolete from the point of view of modern science, in many lectures that teaches that science he often is the first to get a mention, however brief, in the section on the history of the subject. And that is why I decided to start this podcast with him, and he is the subject of the first episode of the History of Biology podcast. That's it for today's episode of the History of Biology podcast. In the next episode, we will continue our journey by further discussing Aristotle's methodology and role as a mentor and a leader by looking at the life and work of Aristotle's second best known pupil and an eventual successor as the leader of the Lyceum, the father of botany, Theophrastus. Don't forget to subscribe and share our podcast with people who are interested in learning about the history of science. And remember, there can be no culture without nature. Thank you for listening.